Welcome, KidLit campers. I am very happy today to be chatting with Christy Yaros, who is a certified book coach and story editor. And we're going to dig into all things that are middle grade and YA. But before we do that, let me introduce Christy to you. Christy works with serious middle grade and young adult writers who want to create stories that engage, encourage, and empower young people. She happily spends her days talking craft and coaxing stories out of her clients. Previous iterations of Christy have done pretty much all the things in the educational publishing world, from proofreader to managing editor to author. Christy holds an MFA in writing for children from Simmons University, and she is also the co-assistant regional advisor for the SCBWI New England. And she hosts the Coaching KidLit podcast, which is an excellent podcast. So welcome, Christy.
Oh, thank you for having me, Sarah.
So
I could talk about this stuff all day, but we won't.
Yes. And we might not quite take you up on that, but we certainly will talk all the things middle grade and YA. So perhaps we should first start by breaking down these categories of books. And I know we have discussed this before, but we want to be careful that we are referring to middle grade and YA as an age category or an audience category as opposed to a genre. And maybe would you like to kind of give us a breakdown of those two categories?
Sure. So middle grade novels are typically aimed at readers ages 8 to 12, and young adult novels are typically aimed at 13 and up, but certainly goes either way. And there are definitely women and other people in their 40s who read YA middle grade religiously. So
yeah. And it seems like in the last few years, we've been seeing maybe a little bit more slicing and dicing even within those categories. So I know that sometimes in the middle grade space, we might talk about a young middle grade or an upper middle grade. Do you have a general idea of how those might break down?
Yeah, like a lower middle grade would target maybe ages 8 to 10 readers, and upper middle grade 10 to 12, and then lower YA like 12 to 15, and upper YA maybe 15 to 18.
Yeah. Okay. And like you said, there's some overlap. So sometimes some of those middle grades might squeak their way up to like age 13 or 14. And some of those YA might, like you mentioned, get down to 12. And
I mean, it all depends on the reader and what they're ready for or what they're interested in. Yeah. Because when you get into that middle kind of overlap, it's not necessarily that the reading level is going to be any different. It's more about the topics and the themes and what that reader is interested in reading,
right?
Or what's available to them,
or sometimes more cynically, what the publisher wants to publish.
I mean, in the end, really, like the categories are marketing categories. Yeah. They're kind of arbitrary in some ways as to how the publisher thinks they're going to sell and where they would fit. Like we always want to think about when we're writing our stories, like where would this go in the bookstore, in the marketplace, and then thinking even about the gatekeepers. We're not putting those books directly in the hands of our middle grade readers. They have to go through teachers and librarians and parents. So is this a book that can get into the hands of a middle grader, or is it more appropriate for a teenager who might be able to get their hands on it themselves?
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you mind if we look a little more closely at middle grade first, perhaps? Sure. So like we talked a little bit about the age groups, but like what's an overview of what we might expect out of a middle grade novel?
So theme wise, or should we talk about word count?
Sure.
But the awful word count, which is also somewhat arbitrary. So, middle grade novels tend to be around 25 to 45,000 words, and fantasy can go maybe a little bit higher. And young adult would generally goes around 50 to 80. Was trending higher for a while with fantasy, paper shortages and paper costs, maybe bringing it back down a little bit. So, but even word count, it is a caveat to anything that we say to you, like they're guidelines, And ultimately the decisions aren't always ours as to whether our books are called middle grade or young adult, how long or how short
Right.
they can be. But so readers tend to read up. So even if your middle grade is aimed at ages 8 to 12, your protagonists are maybe going to be 10, 11, 12, 13. You have 8-year-olds reading those. So the themes need to be appropriate for children of that age. What is it that happens in their own lives? So we see a lot of themes of friendship, and where do I fit in with my family? Where do I fit in my community? Kids that age like adventure stories and fantasy.
Yes, fantasy is very popular in the middle grade. And I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that the kids can play a perhaps more heroic type of role in a fantasy than they might feel that they can in their everyday lives, where they're constantly told by grownups what they can and cannot do. So there's something liberating about that.
Right. And agency is kind of a big theme in middle grade and young adult. These are kids at this age who don't necessarily feel like they have a lot of control over their own choices, right? They're constantly being told what to do by their parents, by their teachers, by society. This is how you're supposed to be. So that it can be a common theme too, of figuring out appropriately at that age how they can have some form of independence or control over what happens to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of, we can assume that as we're moving across this spectrum from lower middle grade to upper middle grade, that as the children are getting older, as the readers are getting older, I imagine the word count gets longer. And I'm guessing, we see some more complex choices, perhaps,
yes,
by way of craft. But of course, we'll still get more complex yet as we
right.
move into
and
YA.
that's something to keep in mind too is and I know you had Lori already speak about the books that come before this. We have to keep in mind the developmental age at what these children are, where they're reading, and how much can they handle. We never talk down to them, right? But the amount of story a 10-year-old can hold in their head is different than the amount of story that a 12 or a 13-year-old can hold in their head. So it's in lower middle grade, we're going to have a lot less subplots. The story is going to be streamlined and more not simple in a simple way, but clearer, less subtext, perhaps. Because they're still learning to read, they're still trying to figure out this stuff, and you don't want the story itself to be a barrier to them understanding what's happening.
So when you're working with writers who are writing a middle grade novel, is that something that you encounter a lot, that perhaps a story is too complex for that middle grade audience?
Yes. And I think that's also where writers who have their word count is too high is usually because from what I've encountered, is because there's too much going on.
Yeah.
That doesn't need to be going on. You can have complexity without having it complicated.
Yeah.
So it's the level of, I like to say, and I know I didn't make this up and I cannot remember who I got this from, but if you think of when a reader starts out reading, you're handing them like a sack, right? And then you're giving them things that they have to carry with them as they're reading the story. So how much,
yes.
how much can an 8-year-old carry through a story if there's 4 different subplots going on and they're supposed to remember how all of these things weave together and that all have to come to a satisfying end? Right. If you have too many main-ish secondary characters, they all have to have arcs and satisfying things. So how much of that can you fit in 30,000 words, 35,000 words, without having to be too shallow?
Well, that's why we have book 2, right?
In our minds, yes. When we sell it, maybe not so much.
Maybe not quite yet. Okay, so as the kids are getting older and they're moving up through middle grade, and now we reach YA, and you've mentioned the word count and the ages that we would expect. How do the themes of YA novels tend to differ from middle grade?
So now you have kids moving into their teenage years. So now it's more about like, who am I? What is my personality like? What are my relationships like outside of my family? Maybe now you're getting into, and we didn't talk about this with middle grade, but maybe you're getting into more romance type relationships. What am I going to do after high school? What, like just
there's like
more things that are about themselves.
It's like we see some independence certainly in middle grade, but it does start to become like, especially the family unit in YA seems to sometimes be there, sometimes not. Whereas in middle grade, it does tend to be perhaps more central. But I think you said it well, that it's like they're becoming, who am I? Who am I going to be in the world? And so do you find with protagonists, if our readers are in that teenage space, how old do the protagonists tend to be?
So this is like a kind of one of those tricky ones, because so typically, for 15, 16, 17, 13, we don't see a lot of 14-year-olds.
Yeah.
And I see a lot on Twitter and Instagram, like the calls for it, because in some ways YA jumps to some of those heavier things where maybe the reader isn't. I was a very innocent 13, 14-year-old, very naive. Like I would not have, I needed some of those stories that were not focused maybe on romance, not focused on some of those heavier things.
It's like you want the stories of I don't know, am I going to make the basketball team? Like these are relevant to incoming high school freshmen. We don't necessarily need to jump to my best friend's unexpected pregnancy all of a sudden, right? It does seem to be this.
It depends. And so there's like that call for it, but then at the same time, you see them saying that they don't sell. So like, which is it? Teachers and librarians are like, where are those books for?
We would buy them. We'll buy them.
13, 14. I know. So, but like marketing, it's not even, our kind of decision, but you will, regardless of topic, you can see more introspection in the character in a YA, right? Middle graders aren't necessarily thinking so deeply about all of like how all of the stuff works and what's happening inside my head. They're not like emotionally ready to process some of that stuff. But teenagers are more, as any of us who have kept our poetry from when we were teenagers know how introspective.
And you'll be publishing those when.
And maybe self-centered we were, like it's more about us. But that also gives you the ability to now have more complex stories. We can have more subplots with other things happening, because the reader can, we're at a point now, readers know how to read a story. They know how to take it in, so they can handle more of those a little maybe slower pace, not slow, but like introspection is going to slow you down. And a middle grade reader may not have the patience for that. They just want
that makes sense. So since you've mentioned the reflection, the introspection, we should probably talk about voice, because that does kind of give a YA novel a certain flavor to it in terms of the voice. Everybody knows that like voice is so critical for YA, but it's also critical for middle grade just for different reasons. Perhaps I've heard from people that middle grade voice is actually one of the hardest to lock into. So I don't know if you have any comments regarding middle grade and YA voice, but I would love to hear them.
That certainly is something that we hear a lot from agents and editors about nailing that voice, because we're adults, we're writing things for ages that are not us, and it may be easier to remember what it was like to be a teenager. And I mean, I'm still 16, like inside I'll always be 16. So that's easier for me to access perhaps, but that I think we forget how innocent middle grade students are, like the, and I know your kids are that age, like mine just graduated college. Like I can't even remember some of, I find stuff that I found this like a couple of weeks ago, like something she made when she was 8,
Oh,
like what she wrote. And it's so much more innocent than we give them credit for, even if they seem like they're more mature, like they're still emotionally, that they're still kids. And to nail that voice is, I mean, you really have to do the research, and that kids today don't sound the same way that we sounded when we were in
right.
middle grade, that our parents sounded like they were in middle grade. And how do you nail that without it being too, I don't know, you see a lot of like, this is a very precocious child is the kind of,
Right.
the way to get around trying to make it authentic. It's no, well,
Right.
this kid is very precocious. Like, okay, well, they're not all precocious. So it's reading a lot of successful middle grade YouTube. They put themselves on YouTube all the
Yeah.
time, on TikToks, on, observing.
That's probably one area where people who work with children have a little bit of an upper hand when it
Right. If
comes
you're
to
a
that.
teacher or a librarian and you work in a middle school, like you have, that's, or when I used to be able to, I can say that now, I used to be able to, when I used to be forced to drive my daughter everywhere, and they'd be in the back seat listening to those
Yes.
conversations, the stuff that they talk about. Like, it is so much more innocent sometimes than what we think, is going through their heads. Whereas the teenagers are definitely like internalizing things more
Yeah.
than middle graders. But
Yeah.
a good middle grade voice is a good middle grade voice. I mean, you
Yeah.
kind of know when you've nailed it.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. So, um, because these categories can be somewhat fluid, and it's like sometimes you read a book and you're like, well, that's clearly middle grade, and you read a book and that's clearly YA, and then there's some in between that are a little bit more ambiguous. When you're working with writers, how do you approach something that might be in the wrong category? Like if a writer thinks they've written YA, but they've got a 13-year-old protagonist who's trying to, I don't know, make friends at summer camp, for instance, and you're like, ooh, that sounds more middle grade to me. Like how do you handle that type of situation?
Well, I think you need, and as coaches, this is something that we always encourage our clients to do, right? Is like, let's look at what the actual story is that you're trying to tell. What's the important piece here? What theme are you trying to get at? What are you trying to say about the world? What do you want the reader to feel? And then how, and I have like what I call your non-negotiables. Like, what are the things that you're like, this has to be in my story. So if like your character has to be 14 years old or has to be 16 years old, and then you're writing a YA, but then what can we change to make sure that that is a YA? And the same thing for middle grade. But I think a lot of times it comes down to like how, I had a client who had thought they were writing a middle grade, but had a number of romance subplots. Well, that bumps it to YA, because in middle grade, we're dealing with maybe first crushes. We're not dealing with serious,
Right.
looking for long-term relationships in a middle grade, right? So
Right.
that if that's important to you, then that's now a YA, and you have to age that character up.
Right.
If they feel like they're more like the theme is more about within the, like, where do I fit in my family as opposed to where do I fit in the world, then maybe, sometimes you're gonna have to change the age of your character. Or if the voice that you've given your character, you just can't get it to be middle grade or YA, then I had a client who was working on a novel in verse, and we thought it was middle grade, but it was on that cusp that
Yes.
the age And then getting a critique from an editor was like this character really feels like he wants to be YA to me. So then it was like adding another, then we had to up the complexity of some of the stuff to make it feel more YA, since the character was more YA. So a lot of times it's kind of a feeling, but you could also sell the book and the editor can say, let's make this a middle grade, let's make this YA. I know we get such arbitrary advice, like the book is what the book needs to be.
Right.
Right. But to an extent, that's true. I don't know that you necessarily have to know from the outset. If you're kind of on that border, I don't know that you have to decide before you write. Like maybe you write the story, we try and revise the story, and then we see like, where does this feel better? And what I've seen people who are like, okay, I'm going to make this middle grade, so I just changed their age to 11. Like, no, because right, like we still have to take out all of these extra subplots, and we've got too many characters, and this is going too deep. And I've seen things that had, like in middle grade, we're not putting violence necessarily on the page, right? Stuff happens off page. It might not happen, you can deal with heavier topics, but sometimes it's not happening to the main character, it's happening to somebody else in their life. And so it's, how are they dealing with it? You got to be sensitive to how you want to put these things. And especially, I mean, not that we want to get into this, but it needs to be said with book banning, with the problems that are having, like something we probably will have to think about as writers later is this word, if they're banning books because of things
swear
that
words
they shouldn't be, right? Like, do we need this here? If I'm going to litter my book with F-bombs, and that might mean it can't get into the hands of the readers I want, do they need to be there? Like sex, violence, curses, if they're gratuitous, if it's just trying to be edgy for the sake of being edgy without it actually having an impact that you need it to have on the book, then like, does it need to be there? Do I need to do this?
Right. Which calls into question then too, this confusion that sometimes people might have where they're actually writing an adult book, but misclassifying it as middle grade or YA.
That too. And that too, because maybe it is like, think about why you're trying to write a book for kids. What is it? Especially if you can't get past the, like we will be writing about our own experiences to an extent, because we're writers, that's what we do, right? It might not be the actual situation, but the feelings, we're going to be tapping into our emotional truth. But we have to separate our adult perspective from the kid perspective, because we've had, God help us, I mean, it was 30 years since we've been in high school, that we've had the time to reflect, and we have the wisdom now to look back at a situation. And if sometimes you see manuscripts where like this character is too introspect, like has too much, can analyze the situation in a way that, no, that's really an adult way. That's an adult theme. And if you struggle with like, no, I want this on the page, I want this violence in here, I want this sex in here, I want this language in here. And again, like we have gatekeepers that we have to get past. And if that's, something you don't want to, then you can aim for the adult market. There are crossovers. Yeah. Kids read adult books. Obviously, adults read kids' books. So, I think ultimately it's, who do I want this book? Whose hands do I want this book in?
Yeah, that makes sense, because probably even in breaking down whether you're writing middle grade, YA, adult, that who is my ideal reader becomes the top question, right? Because that's probably going to act as a North Star on some of these decisions that you're going to make.
Yeah. And we always come back to that, like for anything that you're writing, right? Like who do I want? Who am I writing the story for? And what do I want them to get from this? And if, maybe your book is for adults who had this kind of childhood, and look at this now, wisdom we can show you that from the years past, right? Or do you want that 8-year-old who's going through that now to see what it's like? You can't give them the wisdom of having been a grown-up now, right? To look back on it, but you can maybe change your own story the way that it happened to you to give a better ending.
And you can provide them with some hope, like it'll be okay because you made it through.
and that's definitely something too. Middle grade novels kind of need to end with hope. We can't be depressing our middle grade readers. Nobody wants that. That's not, so if you want to have a nihilistic thing, or you want to have a super tragic ending, maybe middle grade isn't the right place for that. YA still, I mean, maybe it can be bittersweet, but it's not going to also, you don't want to depress them. So,
right.
But adult novels, I mean,
you can do what you want.
You can do Disclaimer, I do not read adult novels. I really only read because I also like those hopeful and happy endings. But.
Yeah, it's so important. So I think we've given everybody a breakdown here of these different categories, and perhaps the best way people can continue to learn about these things is to read widely across both genres and to see what's out there, and certainly finding comp titles for the type of book they want to write can be helpful. If it's like, oh, I like this book, it's YA, maybe that's more the direction I'm going to lean. But like you said, we talk about these things now, and who knows, next year they could be entirely different.
And maybe a new imprint will come out that only wants to, there's a couple of 0 to 13 imprints. Maybe there's like an imprint that only wants to do
10 to 15 12, or something, right? That would be amazing.
But that's why I think ultimately also it's write the story that you want to write, and then figure out how. I've seen some people suggest like maybe try pitching it as a middle grade and see if you're on that border, and see what someone says. I think editors and agents can look past some of that stuff too, and they can say, this may be more of a middle grade, but I still like it.
Yeah.
This might be more of a YA, but I still like it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the quality of the book stands for itself.
Yes. So. And at the end of the day, marketing and business decisions trump any of ours.
That is true. So thank you so much. And we'll certainly have links to your website, and the podcast is fabulous. So I encourage everybody to have a listen to that. You guys have recorded 13, 14, 15, 18. I've listened to them all. I should be keeping better track, but there's a wonderful backlist.
This week, there'll be a new one, I believe, depending on where we are. First Wednesday of every month.
Yes. So we'll put a link to all that. And then you have a really unique, like a group coaching community program, which is amazing because it's entirely for authors of middle grade and YA, people working on those types of novels. And do you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. So we are opening our doors again July 1st for some new people. We run 6 months at a time, but people can stay longer, and 6 months because we want to follow. So you and I are both Author Accelerator certified coaches. So we have certain tools and programs that we follow. And I wanted to create a space 12 by 12. If you're a picture book person, 12 by 12 is a fantastic place for you. I wanted something for those of us who do novels. So it's all people writing middle grade and young adult. We've got an online community. We do workshops every month. We do craft things. We share our work. It's
pretty cool
community.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
A good community and a good place if you want to really focus on your craft.
Right. Yes, you are definitely amazing for that. So I want to thank you for joining us, and
thank you for having me.
We will see everybody in some later sessions. Thank you, campers.
Thank you.